The winter night settled over Hollywood, blanketing the town in stillness as frost glazed the empty streets. Officer Marcus Jennings, his seasoned frame leaning into the worn leather seat of the patrol car, glanced at his partner, Sandra Torres. She'd only been his partner for a few months, her calm demeanor and sharp intuition a welcomed asset to his years of experience. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow on their faces, marking a rare moment of quiet in an otherwise unpredictable job. "So," Marcus murmured, breaking the silence, "how are you finding Hollywood? Must be a bit different from the city." Sandra looked out the window, a faint smile on her lips. "Quieter, for sure. But there's something to be said for the peace and knowing the people around you. Even in the short time I've been here, it feels familiar." "Give it time." Marcus chuckled. "This place has a way of growing on you." Their conversation was cut short by the sudden crackle of the radio. Dispatch's voice, calm yet urgent, filled the car. "All units, we have a 911 report of a suspected burglary at 1247 Windbrook Street. Caller identifies as Nate Walker, 82-year-old male, veteran status." Instantly, the atmosphere in the car shifted. Marcus straightened, his years of training kicking in, and flipped on the siren. Sandra responded on the radio, her voice steady. "Unit 14 responding. ETA approximately 5 minutes." As they sped through the quiet streets, Marcus couldn't shake an unexplainable feeling of unease. Hollywood had its share of petty crimes, but something about this call, the mention of the caller's age, his veteran status, the lonely street out by Windbrook, felt off. "Do you know this Walker fellow?" Sandra asked, her eyes scanning the dark streets as they raced through the town, red and blue lights flashing. Marcus shook his head. "Not that I recall. Windbrook's on the edge of town, mostly quiet folks out there. Isolated. Not many reasons to go out that way." Sandra nodded. "Not the typical target for a break-in then. But who knows?" "Exactly," Marcus murmured. "Sometimes, though, isolated's exactly what they're after. Less chance of witnesses." They turned onto Windbrook Street, where houses were sparse and fields stretched out under the thin layer of snow. In the distance, a flickering porch light came into view, a lonely beacon casting pale light over the sagging silhouette of a modest, weather-worn house. Marcus slowed as they neared, the eerie stillness settling heavily around them. They stepped out, the cold biting against their cheeks, and made their way to the dimly lit porch. A frail, elderly black man stood at the door, bundled in layers of clothing that seemed far too large for his slender frame. Beside him, an old Labrador retriever sat quietly, its eyes following them with cautious interest. "Mr. Walker," Marcus called out, approaching the porch. "I'm Officer Jennings. This is Officer Torres. We got your call." Nate Walker nodded, his movements slow, each breath visible in the cold air. His voice, rough and low, carried a hint of exhaustion. "Appreciate you coming out. I heard a noise out back. Glass breaking. Checked myself, but the window was busted." He gestured feebly toward the rear of the house. Sandra glanced at Marcus, a silent exchange of concern passing between them. "Do you mind if we take a look?" she asked. Nate nodded, stepping off the porch with deliberate care. "Course. Follow me." They walked slowly around the house, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The Labrador stayed close to Nate, its loyalty evident in every cautious step it took by his side. As they rounded the corner, Marcus's flashlight illuminated the broken window, glass scattered like ice on the snow beneath. "There it is," Nate murmured, his voice tinged with sadness as he took in the damage. Marcus bent down to examine the scene, careful not to disturb the shards. The break pattern suggested a quick, deliberate impact, but there were no signs of anyone having climbed inside. Sandra shone her flashlight along the ground, noticing a set of footprints leading from the window toward the street. "Mr. Walker, did you hear anything else?" "Voices? A vehicle?" Marcus asked, his eyes never leaving the broken glass. "No, sir," Nate replied. just the noise. And then, quiet. Buddy here started barking, and by the time I got to the window, whoever it was must have left. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on Nate's tired face. There was something in the man's expression, a mix of anxiety and weariness that felt older than the lines on his face. Despite the cold, beads of sweat dotted his forehead, and his shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight. "We'll make sure everything's secure," Marcus reassured him. "Would you mind if we looked inside as well, just to check for any further damage?" For a moment, a flicker of hesitation crossed Nate's face, his eyes darting to the ground before he managed a slow nod. "All right. Come on in." As they returned to the front, Marcus exchanged a glance with Sandra. She gave a subtle nod, her own suspicions echoing his. Inside, the house was dim, the faint odor of damp and old newspapers hanging in the air. The warm, almost stifling temperature stood in stark contrast to the frigid night, and Marcus quickly noticed the outdated space heater humming from across the room. The living room was cluttered, nearly every surface covered with books, old photos, and stacks of newspaper, signs of a man who'd lived a life steeped in memory. Marcus couldn't help but notice how Nate's breathing grew labored as he led them deeper into the house, and the way his frail hands shook as he gestured toward the kitchen, where the broken window was located. The kitchen was small, with mismatched plates stacked in the sink and a lone flickering bulb casting a dim light over the room. Glass from the window was scattered on the floor, a stark contrast to the neat stacks of papers and worn, familiar dishes. Marcus took a moment to examine the shattered window, noting the way the edges splintered outward. Sandra's gaze shifted to the stove. It was on, a small pot of water simmering on the front burner. She furrowed her brow, a sense of worry creeping over her as she called out to Nate. "Mr. Walker, is the stove your only source of heat?" He looked away, his voice soft but edged with something Marcus couldn't quite name. "The boiler went out last winter. Got no one to fix it. This old stove keeps the chill off, and it's good enough for me and Buddy." Marcus and Sandra exchanged a look. Using the stove as a primary heat source was dangerous. The risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning was significant, especially in a home as tightly shut as this one. Sandra turned back to Nate, her voice gentle but firm. "That can be very dangerous, Mr. Walker. It's not safe for you or Buddy." Nate's gaze dropped, his hand resting on Buddy's head, a flicker of shame passing over his face. "I know," he admitted, his voice thick with unspoken regret. "But I don't have much choice these days. It's just me and Buddy here." Marcus felt a pang of empathy as he looked at the old man standing before him, a figure worn down by years of hardship, yet still carrying an unbroken resilience. Nate's frailty was apparent, his quiet defiance a testament to a lifetime of learning to manage alone. In that moment, Marcus understood. The burglary wasn't the real issue. Nate Walker was a man hanging by a thread, his pride preventing him from asking for the help he so desperately needed. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said gently, meeting his eyes, "maybe there's a way we can help, not just for tonight, but long term. You don't have to go through this alone." Nate looked up, his gaze tired but defiant. "Help." His voice cracked as he whispered, "Help hasn't been something I could count on in a long time." As he stood in that dim kitchen, surrounded by years of memories and the quiet hum of the stove, Marcus felt his world shift. This wasn't just a call. It was a call for something much greater, something that would push him to reevaluate his own understanding of duty, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve. The weight of Nate Walker's words lingered in the air as Marcus and Sandra stood in the dimly lit kitchen. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the soft hum of the stove, which Nate used as a lifeline against the cold. Marcus shifted his gaze, noticing the faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, and the years of wear evident in every corner. The neglect was not just of the home. It was a reflection of a man who'd lived through more than anyone should have to bear alone. Sandra, ever attentive, broke the silence with a gentle tone. "Mr. Walker, when was the last time you had someone over?" "Family," Friends, maybe a visit to the VA. Nate looked down, his lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest quiver betraying a buried emotion. Haven't seen much of anyone since my wife passed. Been a long time. His voice was barely a whisper. Buddy here is all the company I need. The Labrador at his side gave a soft, affirming whine, pressing closer to his master. Marcus watched the dog's eyes, weary yet filled with unwavering loyalty. The bond between Nate and Buddy was palpable, a silent testament to the years they had shared, side by side. Marcus glanced at Sandra, exchanging a look that needed no words. They both knew this situation was more complex than a broken window and needed more than a one-night fix. In his years on the force, Marcus had responded to countless calls, each one a chapter in someone's story. But rarely had he felt the gravity of someone's life bearing down on him like he did now. This wasn't a mere call for assistance. It was a cry for connection, a lifeline from a man who had slipped through the cracks of society. "Mr. Walker," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with an unusual warmth, "I understand you want to manage on your own. I respect that. But sometimes, even the strongest among us need a bit of help. If not for you, then maybe for Buddy." Nate's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability, his pride bristling at the implication. "Help? That's a nice idea, officer. But people have been offering help my whole life. Help that comes with strings, or pity, or a handout that makes you feel smaller every time you take it." He looked down at Buddy, the Labrador's eyes watching him with understanding beyond words. "We've been fine on our own." Marcus nodded, understanding the guardedness, the pride that had become Nate's armor. But he also sensed the strain it had put on him. The world hadn't been kind, and Nate had long since learned to rely only on himself. Sandra took a step forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "Mr. Walker, I know we're strangers, but if you give us a chance, maybe there's something we can do. Not out of pity, but out of respect. You served this country, put your life on the line, and I think you've earned the right to be treated with dignity." Nate's expression softened, his defiance slowly waning as he glanced between the two officers. "You talk like you know what it's like, Officer Torres. But I doubt you do. Folks like me, we're forgotten. They take what they need from you and leave you to fend for yourself." Sandra's face remained impassive, but her eyes conveyed a deep empathy. "My father was a veteran," she replied quietly, surprising even Marcus. She rarely spoke of her past, her family. He never liked asking for help either. But there came a day when he needed it, and it made all the difference. The tension in Nate's shoulders eased a little as he took in her words. He looked down at Buddy, stroking the old dog's head, his gaze distant. "It's been me and Buddy for a long time now. He's all I got left." "Maybe he doesn't have to be," Marcus said softly. "There are programs, services specifically for veterans, ones that don't require you to jump through endless hoops. We could put you in touch with someone who can help without making you feel like you owe anyone." For a moment, Nate remained silent, staring out the dark window. His mind was far away, perhaps lost in memories of his service, the days when he'd been strong, needed, and respected. His voice was softer when he finally spoke. "People say that a lot, you know. We're here to help. I used to believe it." Sandra took a step closer, her tone gentle yet unwavering. "We're not here to make promises we can't keep. But if you'll let us, we can try to get you the help you need, Mr. Walker." Nate's gaze met hers, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of hope, hesitant and fragile, but there. "Well, if you think you can help, maybe it wouldn't hurt to see what you're talking about." Just then, Buddy shifted, nudging Nate with a soft whine. The old man's face softened as he looked down at his faithful friend. "We've been through a lot, me and this old boy. Can't let him suffer on my account." Marcus felt a surge of respect for the man. Even in his hardship, Nate's first thought was for Buddy. It spoke volumes about the kind of man he was, and Marcus found himself determined to do whatever he could to help. "First things first," Marcus said, turning back toward the broken window. "Let's secure the house. I'll call a repairman to get that window fixed up tonight, on the department's dime." Nate opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus held up a hand. "No arguments, Mr. Walker. This is for Buddy, too." After some hesitation, Nate relented, giving Marcus a begrudging nod of thanks. Marcus placed a call to a local contractor he knew, explaining the urgency. Within minutes, arrangements were made for a late-night repair. While they waited, Sandra took the opportunity to check around the rest of the house. She noted the space heater in the living room and quietly advised Nate about the risks of keeping it running unsupervised. She could tell he was embarrassed by the state of things, but he offered no excuses, his silence reflecting years of struggling in solitude. "Thank you," Nate finally said, his voice soft as Marcus returned to the kitchen. "Not many folks go out of their way for an old man these days." "It's what we're here for, Nate," Marcus replied. He felt a stirring within him, a sense of duty that went beyond the badge he wore. This was about more than just a job. It was about humanity, about lifting each other up when no one else would. The repairman arrived, a burly middle-aged man named Tom who worked swiftly to patch up the window. While Tom worked, Sandra took the opportunity to learn more about Nate's life, his days as a soldier, his family, and the struggles he'd faced upon his return. Nate opened up more than either officer expected, revealing a life marked by service, loss, and resilience. When the window was finally secured, Nate offered a small nod of gratitude, his eyes conveying a depth of emotion he didn't put into words. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a hint of relief in the man's expression, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to accept their help. "Mr. Walker," Sandra said gently as they prepared to leave, "we'll be back to check in on you. In the meantime, if you need anything, you call us directly. Don't wait until things get tough again." Nate hesitated, glancing away as if embarrassed, but then gave a reluctant nod. "All right, officers, I'll do that." As Marcus and Sandra stepped out into the cold night air, Marcus felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. Helping Nate tonight was only the beginning. He wanted to make sure that this man, and others like him, weren't left to struggle in the shadows of a society they had once served. As they climbed into the patrol car, Sandra turned to him, her eyes reflecting the same determination he felt. "Think he'll actually call us?" Marcus stared out into the distance, the lonely porch light casting Nate's house in a faint glow. "Maybe not at first, but I think we made a difference tonight. And sometimes, that's all a person needs to keep going." He pulled out of the driveway, glancing back at the small house in his rearview mirror. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself, and to Nate, that this wasn't the last they'd see of each other. Hollywood had a way of keeping its secrets, but Marcus was determined that this one wouldn't be hidden any longer. The winter dawn crept over Hollywood in shades of muted gray, the sunlight struggling to break through the overcast sky. Despite the early hour, Marcus was already up, his mind preoccupied with the events of the previous night. Nate Walker's worn face, the quiet dignity he held onto even as his circumstances crumbled around him, had left an impression that Marcus couldn't shake. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, Marcus considered his next move. The quick repair had patched the window, but he knew the problem went much deeper. It was painfully clear that Nate was living in isolation, clinging to his pride, even as it cost him his health and safety. A simple repair wouldn't fix the years of neglect and hardship Nate had endured. No, he needed something more enduring. After a brief internal debate, Marcus decided he would reach out to the local veterans organization. Hollywood's veteran community was small but tight-knit, often gathering at the community center for meetings and meals. Marcus figured if he could connect Nate with some of these resources, maybe the man would accept a helping hand from people who shared similar experiences. "Hey, Marcus, you're up early." Sandra's voice startled him out of his thoughts. She was standing at the door, clutching a steaming coffee of her own, and looking every bit as troubled as he felt. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, offering her a seat at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about Nate. Last night was a band-aid at best. He's in bad shape, Sandra. That house, it's barely holding together, and so is he. Sandra nodded, her gaze drifting out the window. Yeah, I've been thinking about him too. I've seen people in tough situations before, but this felt different. It's like he spent so many years building up walls that he doesn't know how to let anyone in anymore. Marcus sighed, nodding in agreement. Pride can be a strong fortress. Sometimes, though, it keeps you from reaching out, even when you're on the edge. Sandra took a sip of her coffee, a thoughtful look crossing her face. I wonder if there's a way we could reach him through Buddy. That dog is his world. If we approach it as helping him care for Buddy, maybe he'll be more receptive. Marcus considered this, nodding slowly. You might be onto something. It's clear that Nate's priority is Buddy's well-being. Maybe we can get in contact with one of those pet welfare organizations. They could offer assistance for Buddy, and in the process, Nate would be more open to the support he clearly needs. Sandra smiled, a spark of hope lighting her eyes. I'll look into it. If we can get someone to provide vet services or help with supplies, it might make a world of difference. Good thinking. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Let's also look into the community center. They have programs for veterans, including some social events. I'll bet if we could convince Nate to visit even once, it would help him realize he's not as alone as he thinks. Sandra agreed, and they split their tasks for the day, determined to set the wheels in motion to help Nate in a meaningful way. Later that morning, Marcus placed a call to Holwood's Veterans Affairs representative, a woman named Margaret who'd worked in the community for decades. Margaret was known for her dedication and for her tenacity in helping veterans who had been forgotten by the system. Marcus, good to hear from you. Margaret's warm, slightly raspy voice came through the receiver. What can I do for you? Margaret, I've got a bit of a special case here, he began, explaining Nate's situation as succinctly as he could. He's proud, doesn't want any handouts, but it's clear he's struggling. I think he could really use a connection with some of the other veterans, maybe even a bit of financial help if we can find a discreet way to provide it. Margaret was silent for a moment, processing the story. I know the type, she finally replied. Pride's as much a part of them as the uniform they wore. It's hard to accept help after a lifetime of independence. But you're right, we can't let him slip through the cracks. I'll reach out to a few folks who might be able to help without making him feel pitied. Thanks, Margaret, Marcus said, a sense of relief washing over him. I'm thinking maybe if we position it as a way to help Buddy, he'd be more open to it. Margaret chuckled, clearly understanding the tactic. Good call. That dog's probably been his family for years. I'll reach out to some of the vets associations and see if we can set up a subtle support network. We'll make sure Nate thinks it's for Buddy's benefit. And Marcus? Yeah. Thank you. I know this isn't exactly in your job description, but it makes all the difference. Sometimes it takes someone on the inside to see what's really happening. As Marcus hung up, he felt a sense of satisfaction. This was what the badge was supposed to be about, he thought, not just enforcing the law, but serving the community, connecting with people, and making their lives better in any way he could. By early afternoon, Sandra had reached out to a local pet welfare group, explaining Nate's situation in a way that maintained his dignity, but highlighted his need. They were more than willing to assist and agreed to arrange for a routine checkup for Buddy, offering it as a service they provided to community members who'd been recommended by the local police. Around noon, Marcus and Sandra regrouped in the car and decided to pay Nate another visit. They wanted to present the offers as casually as possible, not to overwhelm him. The ride over was quiet, both officers wrapped in their own thoughts, preparing for the delicate conversation that lay ahead. When they arrived at Nate's house, they noticed the repairman's work had held up well, though the rest of the property looked as weathered as ever. They approached the door and knocked gently. After a few moments, Nate answered, Buddy at his side, his gaze cautious but not unfriendly. Officers, Nate greeted, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Marcus smiled warmly. We just wanted to make sure everything's all right. After all, last night wasn't exactly a typical visit. Nate nodded, gesturing them inside, and they settled into the small, cluttered living room. Marcus took note of the faded military memorabilia scattered throughout: old medals, sepia-toned photos, a framed American flag, each piece telling a story of a life that had once been marked by pride and purpose. Sandra broke the silence, her tone light and casual. We actually came by because I mentioned Buddy to a friend who works with a local pet organization. They love supporting animals, especially in veteran households. They thought Buddy might enjoy a checkup, and they can even help with supplies if you're interested. Nate's eyes shifted to Buddy, his expression softening as he absently scratched the dog's head. Well, that's mighty kind of them, but we've been managing just fine. Sandra smiled gently, reading the hesitation in his eyes. It wouldn't be any trouble, Mr. Walker. They'd consider it an honor to support someone who served our country. And besides, it's just a checkup. Buddy here looks healthy, but it never hurts to be sure. Nate looked down, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gave a slow nod. If it's just a checkup, I suppose that wouldn't hurt. Relieved, Sandra continued. And there's one more thing. I know it might sound like a lot, but the community center hosts veteran socials. They're pretty laid back, nothing formal, just coffee, donuts, and folks sharing stories. They'd be glad to have you join, even if it's just to stop by and see some familiar faces. Nate's face grew serious, his gaze drifting to the worn military medal on the wall. Been a long time since I sat with other vets. Since I told those stories. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and reassuring. I think they'd appreciate hearing them, Nate, and I have a feeling you'd be welcome there in ways you may not expect. For a moment, silence filled the room as Nate processed the offer. Then he looked at Buddy, a flicker of something warm and hopeful in his eyes. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to see some familiar faces, just once. Marcus smiled, feeling that he and Sandra had finally broken through some of Nate's walls. They'd planted a seed, and he could only hope it would grow into something that would bring Nate back to the sense of belonging he had lost. As they left, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about helping Nate get by. It was about helping him live again, surrounded by a community that valued and understood him. The next few days passed in a flurry of phone calls, plans, and arrangements. Marcus and Sandra had managed to coordinate several different sources of support for Nate, all designed to keep his pride intact while gently integrating him into a support network he could trust. On a crisp Saturday morning, Marcus found himself driving out to Nate's house with a van from the local animal welfare organization following close behind. The van was filled with supplies: dog food, a new collar, a plush dog bed, and a kit for Buddy's routine checkup. The plan was to present these items as gifts for Buddy, hoping it would ease Nate into the idea that support was available for him too. Sandra had arranged for Nate to meet with a couple of veterans at the community center later in the week. She had spoken with them personally, asking that they keep the conversation casual, a chance to share stories and relate as peers. The center director had even suggested making it a coffee on the house day, encouraging Nate to come without any pressure. As they pulled into Nate's driveway, Marcus saw Nate sitting on the porch with Buddy at his feet, his gaze distant but somehow lighter than it had been the last time they met. When Nate saw Marcus stepping out of the car, he gave a small wave, his lined face breaking into a hint of a smile. "Morning, Officer Jennings," Nate called out. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you back here so soon." "Good morning, Nate," Marcus replied, smiling as he walked up to the porch. "We're here on Buddy's behalf. Figured it was time he got the royal treatment." Nate chuckled, glancing down at Buddy, who was already wagging his tail in excitement. "Well, I'll be." Buddy's never had a personal delivery before. The van door opened, and a young woman from the animal welfare group, Emma, stepped out carrying a bag of supplies and a clipboard. Her friendly smile seemed to immediately put Nate at ease. She approached Buddy, who sniffed at her curiously, before offering a gentle wag of his tail in approval. "Hi there, Mr. Walker," Emma greeted. "I'm Emma from Pets United. We heard you've got one of the finest veterans in Hollywood, and we wanted to make sure he's got everything he needs to stay happy and healthy." Nate's expression softened, his eyes moving from Buddy to Emma. "Well, that's kind of you. He's been my best friend for years now. Don't know what I'd do without him." Emma knelt down beside Buddy, running her hands along his back with practiced care. "He's in great shape, Mr. Walker. It's clear he's well loved." Buddy, basking in the attention, settled down contentedly, his eyes half closing as he soaked up the affection. Marcus watched the scene, noting how Nate's posture seemed to relax as Buddy received the care he deserved. This was a good start, he thought, a small step, but one that could lead to more openness down the road. "Along with the checkup, we brought a few things for him," Emma said, gesturing to the supplies in the van. "Some dog food, a new collar, a bed. It's all complimentary, of course, just our way of showing appreciation for the both of you." Nate looked down, his hand resting on Buddy's head. There was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, a brief glimpse of vulnerability, as he processed the generosity before him. "You folks don't know how much this means to us," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Buddy here's been through it all with me. Just don't see kindness like this much anymore." Emma smiled gently, sensing the depth of his words. "Well, consider it our way of saying thank you for all you've done too, Mr. Walker." As Buddy enjoyed his checkup, Marcus leaned against the porch railing, observing Nate's quiet pride mingling with an unspoken gratitude. Emma's presence seemed to bring a sense of comfort to Nate, a woman whose warmth and professionalism bridged the divide that Nate often built between himself and the world. When the checkup was finished, Buddy sat contentedly on the porch beside his new bed and supplies, looking happier than Marcus had seen him. Emma shook Nate's hand, promising to check in from time to time to see if Buddy needed anything. Once she left, Nate looked at Marcus, his eyes holding an unspoken question. "This is a lot, officer. All for Buddy." "Consider it a little extra support for both of you," Marcus replied with a small smile. "We don't take care of our veterans as well as we should, Nate. I know it's hard to ask for help, so we figured we'd start by helping Buddy. He's family after all, right?" Nate nodded slowly, a soft sigh escaping his lips. "Yes, he is. Closest thing to family I've got." He paused, glancing down at the dog supplies, and then back up at Marcus. "You know, it's been a long time since anyone's really noticed us. Makes a man wonder if he's even still part of this world sometimes." Marcus took a seat beside him, choosing his words carefully. "You are, Nate. You're part of this town, this community, and we want you to feel that, to know that there are people here who care." Nate looked out over his yard, the lines of his face deepening in thought. "It's not easy, you know, feeling like a burden. After the war, they said they'd help us settle back in. But I found myself more alone than ever. My wife tried, God bless her, but after she passed, it was just me and Buddy, and the world went on. I can't imagine how hard that must have been," Marcus said, his tone somber. "But the world needs people like you, Nate. You've lived through things most people can't even imagine. That matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird nearby. Marcus could see the weight of Nate's isolation, the silent endurance of years spent on the margins, where the world had left him to fade. But there was also resilience, a stubborn determination to keep going despite it all. "Nate," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence, "Sandra mentioned a coffee social at the community center next week. A couple of other veterans will be there. No obligation, but they'd be honored to meet you." Nate looked over, his expression guarded. "I don't know about that, officer. Been a long time since I shared war stories or talked about the old days." Marcus gave a small nod of understanding. "No pressure. Just thought it might be good to see some familiar faces, People who understand. They're not looking for anything from you, just a chance to reconnect. Nate's gaze lingered on Buddy, who had drifted off into a peaceful nap on his new bed. The dog seemed to embody the simplicity of companionship, a bond free from judgment or expectation. Perhaps it was Buddy's contentment that nudged Nate toward a small moment of trust. "Maybe," Nate finally said, his tone tentative but open. "Maybe I'll stop by." Marcus felt a surge of relief, trying to hide his excitement. "If you do, just know that there's no expectation. No need to be anything but yourself. People will be glad to see you, and I'll be there if you need someone to keep you company." Nate gave a brief nod, his eyes holding a glimmer of something Marcus hadn't seen before. Perhaps hope, perhaps the realization that he wasn't as alone as he thought. Marcus knew that moments like these were rare, that a man like Nate had built his walls high and strong. But maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to come down. As they sat on the porch, Nate began to talk about his time in the service, his words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum. He spoke of the friends he had made, the battles he had fought, and the promises made and broken. Marcus listened attentively, careful not to interrupt, allowing Nate the space to share as much as he wanted. It was clear that these memories, though painful, were a part of who he was, scars he carried with pride and sorrow alike. After a while, Nate fell silent, his gaze distant. "You know, officer, I haven't talked about this stuff in years. Thought it was better to leave it behind. But it feels good to remember sometimes, even the hard parts." Marcus nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's what we're here for, Nate. To remember, to honor, and to move forward." Nate's eyes were misty, his hand resting on Buddy's head as he gave a small, almost hesitant smile. "Maybe you're right, officer. Maybe it's time I tried to be part of things again. Just maybe." As Marcus left Nate's home that morning, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond words. He had given Nate something beyond a repaired window or a bag of dog food. He had given him a reason to hope, a reminder that he wasn't forgotten, that his life and his story still held value in the eyes of those around him. And as he drove away, he could see Nate and Buddy standing together on the porch, two figures who had weathered life's storms together, finally beginning to believe that a new chapter might still be waiting for them in the small town of Hollywood. The day of the community center coffee social dawned with clear skies and a rare warmth for the season. Sunlight filtered through bare branches, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground as Marcus pulled up to Nate's house early that morning, hoping to catch him before he could talk himself out of going. He knew that the idea of socializing, even with fellow veterans, would be a big step for Nate. Marcus had seen it before, the way isolation could become a familiar comfort that, though lonely, was safe. But he hoped that today would change things for Nate, if only just a little. As he approached the porch, he noticed Buddy lying contentedly in his new bed, basking in a slant of morning sunlight. Nate sat beside him on an old weathered chair, sipping from a chipped mug, his gaze distant. "Morning, Nate," Marcus called, climbing the steps and taking a seat on the edge of the porch. "Figured I'd stop by and see if you're still up for that coffee social." Nate looked over, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. He raised his mug slightly, a greeting that spoke of a reluctant familiarity that built over the past few days. "I don't know, officer. It's been so long since I've done anything like that. Folks there, they don't know me. Might not even care." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "They'll care, Nate. They're folks just like you, people who understand what it's like to serve, to come home and feel like the world's moved on. They know those same battles." Nate's gaze flickered to Buddy, who gave a gentle thump of his tail as if to encourage him. Nate sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Maybe you're right. Guess it couldn't hurt to give it a try." "Good," Marcus replied, hiding a small smile of relief. "I'll drive. Let's take it one step at a time. Buddy can stay here, or if he'd like, he's more than welcome to come along." Nate glanced down at Buddy, a mixture of affection and uncertainty crossing his face. Think he'd do all right around all those people? Marcus chuckled. I think he'd do just fine. Besides, it's good for everyone to see the hero that's been keeping you company all these years. Nate gave a reluctant smile, a small chuckle escaping his lips as he patted Buddy's head. Well, looks like you're coming too, old friend. Can't let me have all the fun now, can we? They loaded up in Marcus's car, with Buddy comfortably settled in the backseat, his tail wagging contentedly as if he sensed that today was a special occasion. The drive to the community center was quiet, but the silence was companionable, and Marcus could feel a subtle shift in Nate's demeanor. There was a sense of anticipation, the kind that spoke of old wounds being carefully revisited, of memories that were ready to resurface, but had long been buried under layers of pain and solitude. When they pulled into the parking lot, Marcus noticed a few familiar faces milling around outside the center, talking and laughing as they sipped from steaming cups of coffee. Nate watched them, his face a mixture of anxiety and longing, the pull between his need for connection and his fear of vulnerability clear as he hesitated by the car. Take your time, Marcus said gently, placing a hand on Nate's shoulder. You're not expected to do anything but be here. There's no pressure. Nate nodded, taking a steadying breath as he stepped out of the car, Buddy trotting obediently by his side. The pair moved together, a single unit of loyalty and companionship, and as they made their way toward the building, a few of the men outside noticed them, their expressions turning curious and welcoming. Inside, the community center was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of conversation. Veterans of all ages sat in small groups, some talking quietly while others laughed and exchanged stories. A few heads turned as Nate entered, and Marcus noticed a few knowing nods, the silent acknowledgement that only comes from shared experiences. Mr. Walker. A tall man with graying hair approached, extending a hand. Name's Tom. I was in the Navy. We're glad to have you join us today. Nate shook his hand, visibly surprised by the warm welcome. Good to meet you, Tom. I'm Nate. Army. A long time ago now. Tom smiled, his gaze warm and understanding. Doesn't matter how long ago. Once you've served, you're always part of the family. Come on, let's grab you a coffee. As they made their way to the refreshments table, Marcus fell into step beside Nate, noticing how his shoulders began to relax, his expression softening as he listened to the conversations around him. It was as if he were beginning to realize that he was, in fact, welcome here, that these men and women understood him in ways he hadn't allowed himself to believe were possible. They found a spot at a round table near the window, where a small group of veterans gathered, each of them sharing bits of their own stories, moments of camaraderie and hardship that felt both familiar and distant. Nate listened quietly at first, his gaze flicking between the speakers as he absorbed their words. But as the minutes passed, he began to open up, sharing small snippets of his own experiences, memories that had been locked away for years. Did 3 tours, Nate said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of sadness. Came back to a world that didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. Lost my wife not long after. Buddy here, he's been with me ever since. Got me through the worst of it. A few nods of empathy followed, each person at the table understanding the weight of his words, the reality of coming home to a life that felt foreign. Buddy, sensing the shift in Nate's tone, pressed close, his head resting on Nate's knee as if to offer silent comfort. That's the thing about dogs, Tom said, reaching down to scratch Buddy's ears. They don't care where you've been or what you've done. They're just there through it all. Nate's face softened, a small smile breaking through as he looked down at Buddy. He's been more of a family to me than I ever could have asked for. Don't know what I'd do without him. They continued talking, the hours slipping by as stories were shared and laughter filled the room. It was a slow, gentle reminder that Nate was not as alone as he'd once believed. Each tale of resilience and survival, each nod of shared understanding, chipped away at the isolation he'd built around himself. At one point, the conversation turned to the challenges they faced after returning to civilian life, and Nate listened intently, nodding as others spoke of their struggles with adapting, with finding meaning in a world that often failed to recognize their sacrifices. "I guess I just got used to doing things on my own," Nate admitted, his voice quiet. "Learned to rely on myself and Buddy here, but sometimes it's a heavy load to carry alone." Tom nodded, his gaze warm with understanding. "That's why we're here, Nate. None of us should have to carry that weight alone. We're all in this together." The words seemed to resonate with Nate, and for the first time, Marcus saw a genuine smile break across his face, a small but powerful glimmer of hope. It was as if he were beginning to believe that maybe there was still a place for him in this world, a community where he was understood and valued. As the morning faded into afternoon, Marcus watched as Nate engaged more openly, his laughter joining the others, his stories finding a willing audience. It was a transformation he hadn't expected to witness in just one day, but he was grateful, knowing that the old veteran was taking the first steps toward reclaiming the life he thought was lost. When it was time to leave, Nate shook hands with each person at the table, his gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Didn't know how much I needed this." Tom placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling warmly. "You're always welcome here, Nate. Anytime. And next time, you bring Buddy too." As they made their way back to the car, Nate seemed lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked over at Marcus, his expression one of quiet appreciation. "Thank you, officer. Don't know if I would have come without you pushing me a bit." Marcus smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Nate's shoulder. "Sometimes all we need is a little nudge. I'm glad you came, Nate. And remember, you don't have to go back to how things were. There's always a seat at that table for you, whenever you're ready." Nate nodded, his gaze distant but filled with a newfound determination. "Maybe it's time I let people in again. Can't keep holding on to the past forever." As they drove back to Nate's house, Buddy resting peacefully in the backseat, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that today had been more than just a gathering. It had been a bridge, a connection that Nate could hold on to in the days to come. When they reached Nate's house, he stepped out, a quiet smile on his face as he reached down to scratch Buddy's ears. "Come on, old friend," he murmured. "Looks like we got some new friends waiting for us next week." Marcus watched as Nate and Buddy disappeared into the small weathered house, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Nate, that there would be days when the weight of his past would return. But now he had people who understood, a place to go, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to believe that he didn't have to walk this journey alone. The next few weeks brought an undeniable shift in Nate's life. Slowly but surely, he found himself easing into a rhythm that hadn't been part of his world for years. Marcus and Sandra checked in regularly, but Nate also began taking small steps toward reconnecting with the community. He joined the weekly coffee socials at the community center, always bringing Buddy, who quickly became a favorite among the veterans. Their little group grew, stories were swapped, and piece by piece, Nate's guardedness began to fall away, replaced by a quiet but renewed sense of belonging. On a chilly Friday evening, Marcus stopped by Nate's house with Sandra, bringing a surprise he hoped would brighten Nate's world even further. As they pulled into the driveway, they noticed Buddy's old dog bed and collar sitting out on the porch, worn but neatly arranged, a sign of the newfound care Nate had taken in maintaining the little details around his home. Sandra knocked, and within moments, Nate opened the door, his face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Well, if it isn't my two favorite officers," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Come on in. Buddy and I were just settling down for the evening." As they entered, Marcus noted the subtle changes inside Nate's home. The stacks of newspapers were gone, replaced by a few neatly framed photos of his service days, Buddy, and his late wife. There was a soft glow from a new lamp, casting a comforting light across the room. It was clear that Nate had taken the time to reclaim his space, to make it more than just a shelter, but a place of dignity and pride once again. "We brought a little something for you," Marcus said, holding up a folder and a small envelope with a smile. Nate raised an eyebrow, taking a seat on his favorite armchair. "You two have already done more than enough. What's this all about?" Sandra took a seat across from him, smiling gently. "This is actually from the community center, from all the veterans who've gotten to know you. They wanted to show their appreciation, so they organized a little something special." Nate hesitated, looking down at Buddy, who rested his head on Nate's knee, as if sensing his unease. He took the envelope with a nod of thanks, carefully opening it to reveal a collection of gift cards, donations, and a few handwritten notes from the veterans he'd come to know. "For Buddy's food, vet visits, and anything else he might need," Marcus explained. "They wanted you to have a fund specifically for him, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. And the notes, well, that's their way of letting you know how much you mean to them." Nate's eyes lingered on the notes, his fingers tracing over the handwritten words of appreciation and encouragement. I don't know what to say. Can't remember the last time folks did something like this for me." Sandra smiled, her voice gentle. "They're just giving back, Nate. You've brought a lot to their lives, too. Sometimes just being there, sharing stories, means more than words can say." Nate's face softened, a glint of emotion in his eyes as he nodded. "Guess I've missed this, all of it. Didn't realize how much until I had it back." Marcus handed him the folder next. "And this is from a few of the community members who found out about Buddy's importance to you. There's a little surprise inside." Nate opened the folder, and his eyes widened as he saw a certificate of honor made out to Buddy, recognizing him as a loyal companion and community hero for his years of companionship and service to Nate. Below the certificate was a flyer for an upcoming veteran recognition event. On the bottom of the flyer, in neat handwriting, was an invitation to Nate to be one of the featured guests, where Buddy would also be recognized. "It's just a small community event," Sandra explained, her voice soft. "But they wanted to honor both of you, to show you're valued here. Buddy's loyalty and your strength have inspired a lot of people, Nate." For a moment, Nate's voice failed him, and he simply looked down, his hand resting on Buddy's head. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with gratitude. I never thought people would remember me like this, or that they'd see Buddy as more than just an old dog." Marcus leaned forward, his voice filled with reassurance. "You're not just anyone to them, Nate. You've become part of something bigger again, and that's no small thing. It's never too late to feel that connection, to know you're seen." As they sat together in quiet reflection, Nate shared stories he'd never spoken aloud before, recounting moments of joy and heartbreak from his years in the service. He told them about his first deployment, the friendships he'd made, and the day he came home only to find himself in a world that felt foreign and unrecognizable. He spoke of his late wife, his love for her, and the painful emptiness her passing left behind. Through it all, Buddy remained close, his gentle presence a reminder of the loyalty and love that had carried Nate through even his darkest days. It was clear that the old Labrador wasn't just a pet. He was a living connection to the past, a steadfast friend who had walked every step of this journey with him. After a while, Sandra spoke, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "Nate, you've lived through things that most people could never imagine. And yet here you are, still moving forward. That's resilience, true resilience." Nate nodded slowly, his gaze distant but thoughtful. "I guess you're right. Maybe I was so busy surviving that I forgot what it felt like to live. But these past few weeks, with Buddy by my side, and folks like you looking out for me, I feel like I'm starting to remember." The evening passed in comfortable companionship, a warmth filling the room that transcended words. Before they left, Marcus paused at the door, turning back to Nate. "One more thing, Nate. A few of us are organizing a small repair day next week. Some of the veterans, and a few volunteers are going to be helping each other fix up things around their homes. Thought you might like to join us." Nate looked taken aback, his eyes reflecting both surprise and appreciation. "You all don't need to worry about my place. It's held up just fine." Marcus shook his head with a warm smile. "We're not here to worry. We're here to lend a hand, same as anyone would for you. Let us help. Besides, Buddy deserves a porch he can sit on without those creaky boards, don't you think?" Nate chuckled, looking down at Buddy, who wagged his tail in agreement as if he understood every word. "All right, officer. I suppose I'll see you there." A week later, the repair day arrived, and the community center bustled with activity. Volunteers moved from house to house, patching up fences, replacing weathered boards, and even installing a new heating system in Nate's home, an effort spearheaded by Margaret, the Veteran Affairs Coordinator. Nate was initially hesitant, but the kindness and camaraderie of his fellow veterans soon melted away his reluctance. He even lent a hand himself, hammering a few nails and sharing stories as the day wore on. When the repairs were finished, Nate's home had been transformed. The clutter was gone, the floors repaired, and Buddy even had a new bed by the window, where he could watch the world go by in comfort. Nate stood back, marveling at the transformation, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude on his face. As the volunteers gathered to celebrate their hard work, Tom, one of Nate's friends from the coffee social, raised a toast, his voice ringing with pride. "To Nate and Buddy, two heroes who remind us all what loyalty and resilience look like. Here's to many more years of stories, laughter, and community." Everyone raised their glasses, and in that moment, Nate's eyes shimmered with a mixture of joy and gratitude. He looked down at Buddy, who gazed up at him with a quiet devotion that needed no words. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder, his voice filled with warmth. "You're not alone anymore, Nate. You've got family here, people who care. And anytime you need us, we'll be right here." Nate nodded, his voice filled with a quiet, heartfelt acceptance. "Thank you. Thank you all. I never thought I'd find a place like this again." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over Hollywood, Nate stood on his porch with Buddy, watching his newfound family gather, talk, and laugh in his yard. For the first time in years, he felt whole, a man with a history, a community, and a purpose. And as he looked down at Buddy, who leaned contentedly against his leg, he knew that this was the start of a new chapter, a life rekindled by kindness, courage, and the quiet resilience that he and Buddy had carried through all the years. Together, they would walk forward, no longer burdened by the past, but buoyed by the knowledge that they were seen, valued, and above all, never alone again.